December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. 4 battleships sunk. 18 ships destroyed or crippled. Over 2,000 Americans dead. Japan celebrates its greatest tactical victory. But on the deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, one man isn't celebrating. Commander Minoru Genda stands apart from the jubilant pilots. He's running different numbers in his head. Numbers about oil barrels and fuel consumption. Numbers about tanker capacity and production rates. And those numbers are telling him something nobody else wants to hear. Japan just won a devastating battle. But the war was already lost. Not because of what happened at Pearl Harbor, but because of a calculation error made months earlier. A math mistake so catastrophic that it guaranteed Japan's defeat before the first bomb ever fell. Welcome to World War II Ember, where we uncover the untold stories of the war. The morning after Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval officers were drafting reports that would be sent to Tokyo. Victory reports. Detailed accounts of which ships were sunk, which facilities were destroyed, which targets had been hit. The numbers looked impressive on paper, but there was one target that didn't appear in those reports. One target that was never attacked, never even considered a priority, and that oversight would cost Japan everything. 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil sat in storage tanks on the eastern side of Pearl Harbor, 49 massive cylindrical tanks, above ground, visible from the air, completely undefended against aerial attack. Japanese reconnaissance had identified them months earlier. Pilots flying over the harbor that morning could see them clearly, but not one bomb was dropped on them. Not a single attack run was made against the fuel storage facilities. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later state that all of Pearl Harbor's fuel was vulnerable to .50 caliber bullets, let alone bombs. The tanks were built with thin steel walls designed to hold liquid, not to resist military action. A 500-pound bomb would rupture a tank completely. The fuel would pour out and ignite. And once one tank started burning, the heat would be intense enough to rupture adjacent tanks even without direct hits. Fire would spread from tank to tank across the entire complex. All 4.5 million barrels would be destroyed. If those tanks had burned, the consequences would have been immediate and catastrophic. The Pacific Fleet would have been forced to abandon Pearl Harbor completely. Every ship would have had to withdraw to the West Coast. San Diego, San Francisco, Seattle, more than 2,000 miles away. From California, American ships would have needed twice as much fuel to reach Western Pacific war zones. The operational range of every American warship would have been cut in half. American interference with Japanese conquests in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies would have been impossible for at least 12 to 18 months. But that's not what happened. The fuel tanks survived. The Pacific Fleet could refuel. And within days, American ships were conducting search operations looking for the Japanese carriers. In the first 9 days after the attack, the fleet burned through approximately 750,000 barrels conducting those operations, nearly its entire seaborne fuel capacity in just over a week. Without those shore-based tanks at Pearl Harbor, the fleet would have been completely immobilized. So why weren't they attacked? Why did Japanese aircraft focus exclusively on battleships while ignoring the one target that could have crippled American operations for over a year? The answer reveals something far more disturbing than a simple tactical oversight. It reveals a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of modern warfare. A miscalculation built on assumptions that seemed reasonable but proved catastrophically wrong. But here's what nobody realized at the time. Even if those fuel tanks had been destroyed, Japan still would have lost the war, because the real problem wasn't what happened at Pearl Harbor. The real problem was a series of mathematical errors made months earlier. Errors about fuel consumption, about oil production, about how long Japan could actually fight before running out of fuel, and those errors guaranteed defeat before the first shot was fired. In early 1941, Japanese naval planners faced a critical question. Could Japan sustain a war against the United States? Everything depended on oil. Japan imported 90% of its petroleum. In peacetime, Japan consumed approximately 32 to 37 million barrels per year for all purposes, military and civilian combined. Most of that oil came from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. Then, on July 26, 1941, everything changed. The American oil embargo was imposed following Japanese occupation of southern French Indochina. Britain and the Dutch government in exile immediately followed with their own embargoes. Suddenly, Japan was cut off from more than 80% of its oil imports. By September 1941, Japan had approximately 50 million barrels in strategic reserves. The Imperial Japanese Navy alone was consuming approximately 69,600 barrels per day during routine peacetime operations. That translated to over 25 million barrels per year just for the Navy. Add Army consumption and civilian needs, and Japan was burning through its entire 50 million barrel reserve at an alarming rate. Without new sources of oil, Japan would run out of fuel for military operations sometime in 1943. The nation faced two choices: capitulate to American demands and withdraw from China, or go to war to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies before reserves ran out. The Imperial Japanese Navy chose war, but that choice required answering one fundamental question: could Japan win a war against the United States before running out of fuel? That calculation involved three critical assumptions. Each one seemed reasonable. Each was supported by historical precedent or intelligence analysis. Each proved catastrophically wrong, and together, those three assumptions would doom Japan before the war even started. First assumption: the war would be short. Japanese leaders believed the United States would negotiate a settlement after 6 to 8 months of fighting. Americans were soft, accustomed to comfort, unwilling to accept heavy casualties. After initial defeats, they would agree to a compromise recognizing Japanese control of Southeast Asia. This assumption meant fuel consumption calculations only needed to account for a brief campaign. Long-term sustainability didn't matter. 6 months of war. Maybe 8, then negotiation, then peace. Second assumption: Japanese naval operations would follow the decisive battle doctrine that had defined strategy since the 1905 victory at Tsushima. The combined fleet would remain mostly in home waters, waiting for the American Pacific Fleet to steam west. There would be 1 or 2 major fleet engagements, climactic surface actions where Japanese forces would destroy the American fleet in decisive battles. This meant most Japanese ships would spend most of their time at anchor, consuming minimal fuel. Only a small percentage of the fleet would be actively operating at any time. Fuel consumption would be predictable, manageable, relatively low. Third assumption: capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields would solve Japan's supply problem permanently. The oil fields in Borneo, Sumatra, and Java produced 65 million barrels per year in 1940. Japanese planners estimated military consumption at 35 to 40 million barrels annually. Capturing those fields would provide more than enough oil to meet Japan's needs indefinitely. Based on these assumptions, Japanese planners concluded they could fight and win. The mathematics appeared sound. In September 1941, with 50 million barrels in reserve and the prospect of capturing 65 million barrels per year of production capacity, the numbers suggested Japan could sustain a war. The strategy seemed viable. The plan was approved. Orders were issued, and Japan committed to a path that would lead to total destruction. But every single assumption was wrong, and the mathematical errors built into those assumptions were already guaranteeing defeat. The war was not short. The United States did not negotiate after 6 months. Americans responded to Pearl Harbor not with defeatism, but with furious determination. President Franklin Roosevelt's declaration that December 7th would live in infamy united the country in ways Japanese planners never anticipated. American industrial capacity shifted to total war production. Shipyards that built merchant vessels began building warships. Factories that produced automobiles began producing tanks and aircraft. The entire economy mobilized. The conflict would last 3 years and 8 months. Not 6 months. Not 8 months. 3 years and 8 months of continuous, grinding, industrial warfare that consumed resources at rates Japanese planners had never imagined possible. Japanese naval operations did not follow the decisive battle pattern. The Pacific War became something entirely different from what Japanese strategists anticipated. It involved continuous operations across vast distances. Carrier task forces conducting raids on enemy bases thousands of miles from home. Submarines operating on extended patrols. Amphibious assaults requiring massive escort forces. Destroyers constantly shuttling between bases. Every operation required constant movement, constant maneuvering, constant fuel consumption at combat intensity rates. Consider the scale. A single destroyer operating at 15 knots cruising speed consumed approximately 100 tons of fuel oil per day. That same destroyer conducting high-speed operations at 25 to 30 knots consumed 300 to 400 tons per day. Combat operations were never conducted at cruising speed. They were conducted at maximum or near maximum speed. That meant fuel consumption rates 3 to 4 times higher than peacetime planning assumptions. Multiply this across the fleet. By mid-1942, Japan was operating dozens of destroyers simultaneously on various missions, each one burning 3 to 4 times the planned fuel consumption. Add cruisers, which consumed even more. Add carriers and their air groups. Add battleships, massive fuel consumers that burned hundreds of tons per day even at moderate speeds. Add submarines. Add fleet oilers, which consumed fuel while delivering fuel. The total consumption quickly exceeded planning estimates by enormous margins. The actual numbers told a devastating story. Japanese military consumption in fiscal 1942 totaled 41.79 million barrels. Planning estimates had assumed 35 to 40 million barrels. The actual consumption was at the high end of estimates during a year when major operations were still ramping up. Fiscal 1943 consumption reached 43.99 million barrels. This was during the height of Japanese operations in the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. The assumptions that fuel consumption would be manageable and predictable proved completely wrong. Japan was burning oil at rates that exhausted reserves far faster than anticipated. But that wasn't even the worst problem, because capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields didn't solve anything either. When Japanese forces swept through Borneo, Sumatra, and Java in early 1942, they found the oil infrastructure extensively sabotaged. Allied defenders had systematically destroyed as much production capacity as possible before retreating. At Balikpapan in Borneo, one of the richest oil-producing regions in Southeast Asia, Dutch engineers had demolished key facilities. They blew up pumping stations with dynamite. They destroyed storage tanks. They set wells on fire, creating massive blazes that burned for weeks. They dumped concrete down drill holes, rendering wells inoperable. They removed critical components from refinery equipment and threw them into rivers or buried them. The sabotage was thorough. Restoring production required skilled technicians Japan didn't have in sufficient numbers. The Netherlands and Britain had developed sophisticated petroleum engineering expertise over decades. Japan's domestic oil industry was tiny. Annual production from Japanese fields totaled only about 3 million barrels. The entire Japanese petroleum engineering sector was perhaps 1/10 the size of what the Dutch and British had deployed in the East Indies. Most Dutch and British petroleum engineers had been evacuated before Japanese forces arrived. Those who remained were imprisoned rather than put to work. Japan had to send petroleum engineers from the home islands to operate the captured fields, but finding qualified people was difficult. Universities hadn't trained petroleum engineers in large numbers because Japan had virtually no domestic oil industry. Equipment was even more problematic. Oilfield equipment is specialized, heavy, difficult to transport, and impossible to improvise. Japan needed to ship replacement equipment from the home islands, but Japanese merchant shipping was already stretched thin. The same ships that needed to carry oil from the captured fields to Japan also needed to carry equipment to those fields. Ships traveling south carried drilling equipment, refinery components, pumping machinery. Ships traveling north carried crude oil and refined products. There were never enough ships to do both adequately. Production in the captured territories struggled to reach pre-war levels. In 1940, before Japanese invasion, the Dutch East Indies produced 65 million barrels. In 1942, after Japanese occupation, production reached only 25.9 million barrels, less than 40% of pre-war production. The shortfall of nearly 40 million barrels represented oil that didn't exist. That couldn't be captured. That couldn't help Japan win the war. Japanese planners had assumed they would quickly restore full production. They assumed 65 million barrels per year would be available. They based the entire war strategy on that assumption, but actual production was less than half that level. In 1943, production improved to 49.6 million barrels, 76% of pre-war levels, a significant achievement. But by then, the tanker shortage had become critical. And this is where the third catastrophic error revealed itself. Japanese strategists had not adequately calculated how much shipping capacity would be required to transport oil from Southeast Asia to Japan, and more critically, how vulnerable that shipping would be to American submarine warfare. The geography was unforgiving. The distance from Borneo to Japan is approximately 2,000 nautical miles. A typical Japanese tanker in 1941 had a cargo capacity of about 10,000 tons deadweight, which translated to roughly 75,000 barrels of oil. At cruising speed of 11 to 12 knots, the round trip took approximately 4 weeks, including loading and unloading time. That meant a single tanker could theoretically make about 13 trips per year, delivering approximately 975,000 barrels annually if it operated continuously without losses. To transport 49 million barrels, the amount produced in captured territories in 1943, Japan needed approximately 50 tankers in continuous operation. That didn't include tankers needed for moving oil between Japanese ports, tankers supporting naval operations at sea, or tankers that would inevitably be damaged, under repair, or sunk. In December 1941, Japan possessed approximately 49 ocean-going tankers suitable for long-range oil transport. It was barely sufficient for peacetime needs. For war, with all oil coming from distant conquered territories, it was catastrophically inadequate. Building new tankers required shipyard capacity and construction time. A tanker took approximately 8 to 10 months to build, but Japanese shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity building warships, destroyers, submarines, cruisers, aircraft carriers. The Navy prioritized combat vessels over support vessels. Tankers were unglamorous. They didn't sink enemy ships. They didn't win battles. They just carried oil. The priority always went to warships. Meanwhile, American submarines were systematically destroying Japan's tanker fleet. American submarines operated under a doctrine specifically targeting Japanese logistics. Tankers were priority targets. Every tanker sunk represented thousands of barrels of oil that would never reach Japan. Submarines lurked along tanker routes between the Dutch East Indies and Japan. They waited near choke points. Luzon Strait between the Philippines and Formosa became known as a killing ground. Tankers had to pass through to reach Japan from the south. Submarines waited there in ambush. The impact was devastating. Every tanker sunk meant less oil transported, but the effects cascaded beyond simple tonnage losses. Each tanker lost meant remaining tankers had to make more trips to transport the same amount of oil. More trips meant more time at sea. More time at sea meant more exposure to submarine attack. It created a death spiral where each loss made the remaining tankers more vulnerable. Tanker crews became increasingly demoralized as losses mounted. Sailing on a tanker became one of the most dangerous jobs in the Japanese merchant marine. Tankers were slow, poorly armed, often sailed with inadequate escorts because destroyers were needed elsewhere. Crews knew they were priority targets. Tanker captains began taking circuitous routes to avoid known submarine operating areas. Routes that should have taken 4 weeks began taking 5 or 6 weeks. Longer voyages meant fewer trips per year. Fewer trips meant less oil transported even by surviving tankers. By late 1942, the tanker shortage had become critical. Japanese oil imports began declining, not because production in the conquered territories was falling, but because the shipping to transport that oil was disappearing. Oil sat in storage tanks in Borneo and Sumatra with no ships available to move it. The submarine campaign had created a transportation choke point that strangled Japanese oil supplies. By April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the mathematical reality was becoming undeniable. Japanese oil reserves had dropped from 50 million barrels in September 1941 to approximately 38 million barrels. The decline of 12 million barrels in 7 months represented a burn rate far exceeding peacetime projections. Admiral Yamamoto received detailed reports about the fuel situation in May 1942 as he prepared for the operation against Midway. The numbers were alarming. At current consumption rates, even with optimistic assumptions, Japan would exhaust its oil reserves sometime in 1943, possibly as early as mid-1943. The Naval General Staff held emergency meetings throughout the summer and fall of 1942. Every solution discussed had fundamental problems. Build more tankers, but that meant not building destroyers or cruisers, and tankers took 8 to 10 months to build. Reduce operational tempo, but that meant ceding initiative to the Americans. Move fleet units closer to the oil source. But then the decisive battles were happening thousands of miles away in the Central Pacific. The fundamental problem was arithmetic that admitted no solution. Japan needed approximately 40 million barrels per year minimum to sustain military operations. After accounting for submarine losses and transportation inefficiencies, Japan could import at most 20 to 25 million barrels per year from captured territories. Domestic production added only 3 million barrels annually. There was a structural deficit of 12 to 17 million barrels per year. No combination of efficiency measures, operational restrictions, or technical adaptations could close a gap that large. The mathematics were inexorable. By mid-1943, Japanese oil reserves had dropped to approximately 15 million barrels, less than a third of pre-war levels. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carriers operated at the extreme limit of their fuel range. They couldn't maneuver freely because every unnecessary mile consumed irreplaceable fuel. American carriers, by contrast, had virtually unlimited fuel. They were supported by a massive logistics train of fleet oilers. The difference was not about courage or skill, it was about mathematics. By late 1944, Japanese oil imports had collapsed almost completely. Most tankers had been sunk. Many ships sat at anchor with empty fuel bunkers, unable to sortie even when ordered. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese forces made a desperate sortie that consumed most of their remaining fuel reserves. Ships could barely return to port afterward. The fleet was effectively immobilized by fuel exhaustion. April 1945, the battleship Yamato made her final sortie to Okinawa. Operation Tengo was explicitly designed as a suicide mission. Orders called for minimal fuel, just enough to reach Okinawa, where the ship would beach itself and fight as a stationary gun platform. Yamato was sunk by American aircraft on April 7, 1945. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, oil reserves were effectively exhausted. The combined fleet was immobilized. Admiral Yamamoto had understood this from the very beginning. On January 7, 1941, before planning for Pearl Harbor had even begun in earnest, Yamamoto wrote a letter to Navy Minister Kashiro Kawa. In that letter, Yamamoto stated clearly that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. American industrial capacity was vastly greater. American oil production was hundreds of times larger than Japan's. If the war lasted more than 6 to 8 months, Japan would face inevitable defeat. Yamamoto wrote that the only possibility of success was a quick knockout blow that might shock the Americans into negotiating, but even that possibility was remote. Yamamoto never believed Pearl Harbor would achieve a decisive strategic result. He knew the mathematics didn't support a Japanese victory, but he was trapped by institutional pressures. He couldn't publicly refuse to plan the operation. That would have been seen as insubordination, as disloyalty. So Yamamoto planned Pearl Harbor to the best of his ability, knowing it would probably fail strategically. On the morning of December 7th, when Commander Genda stood on Akagi's deck watching the second wave return, he understood all of this. He knew the fuel tanks hadn't been attacked. He knew they should have been attacked. But Genda also knew something else. Even if the fuel tanks had been destroyed, even if Pearl Harbor had been rendered completely useless, the mathematics still didn't work. Japan still didn't have enough oil to win. Destroying Pearl Harbor's fuel tanks would have delayed American offensive operations by perhaps 6 to 12 months, but it wouldn't have changed the outcome. The outcome was determined by mathematics that existed before the first bomb fell. Japan needed approximately 40 million barrels per year to sustain operations. Japan had access to approximately 25 to 30 million barrels per year from all sources combined. The deficit was 10 to 15 million barrels per year. No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome a deficit of 10 to 15 million barrels per year. Industrial wars cannot be fought without industrial resources. Naval operations cannot be sustained without fuel, and arithmetic cannot be wished away because the numbers are politically inconvenient. Multiple officers in the Japanese Navy understood the resource constraints. They understood Japan lacked the oil to sustain a prolonged war, but institutional culture discouraged dissent. Officers who raised objections to approved plans were seen as lacking loyalty. The path to career advancement was supporting leadership decisions, not questioning them. So the people who understood the mathematics stayed quiet. The people who didn't understand the mathematics made the decisions. And Japan went to war with fuel consumption projections that underestimated actual requirements, oil production estimates that overestimated what captured fields could deliver, and tanker capacity calculations that ignored inevitable losses to submarine warfare. Commander Minoru Genda survived the war. He remained in military service, eventually becoming Chief of Staff of Japan's Air Self-Defense Force. In interviews throughout his life, he consistently stated that even if the Pearl Harbor attack had been executed perfectly, even if every target had been destroyed, Japan still would have lost the war. The industrial and resource imbalance was simply too great to overcome. Admiral Yamamoto did not live to see Japan's defeat. He was killed on April 18, 1943, when American fighters intercepted his aircraft over Bougainville. American cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes and learned his flight schedule. Yamamoto died knowing the fuel crisis was developing exactly as he had predicted. He died knowing that no amount of tactical victories could overcome the mathematical realities of oil consumption versus supply. The war was lost in arithmetic. 40 million barrels needed, 25 million barrels available. Everything else, all the battles and sacrifice and tactical brilliance, was just the working out of mathematical inevitability. When nations ignore mathematics because it contradicts political goals, when institutions suppress analysis because it challenges approved strategies, when leaders choose comfortable falsehoods over uncomfortable facts, the result isn't just defeat, it's catastrophe. Japan didn't lose World War II at Pearl Harbor, or Midway, or the Philippine Sea. Japan lost World War II in a planning room in 1941, when officers made calculations about fuel consumption and oil production that were demonstrably, provably, catastrophically wrong, and nobody with the power to stop it was willing to speak the truth. This is World War II Ember. If this story revealed something you didn't know about how wars are truly won and lost, take a moment to like this video. Subscribe to continue uncovering the mathematical realities that official histories overlook. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. These stories matter because they remind us that courage and determination cannot overcome arithmetic. Until next time, remember the past, question the assumptions, and never forget that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with numbers that nobody wants to believe.